Hello there. Today I'd like to share with you the second of two wines from a group called Domaines Les Emissaires. And this particular wine is from Pomerol. It's Clos Bel Air. It's the 2022 vintage of this. I noticed that this is bottle 1747 out of 4,000 made. I also noticed that it won a gold medal in the London Wine Competition in 2024. So let's see what we make of this, shall we? So the group, Les Domaines de l'Emissaires, purchased 4 properties in 2022 that had formerly been under the ownership of a Chinese businessman and his associates, somebody called Chi Keung Tong. And he'd purchased 4 estates: Clos Bel Air in Pomerol, Châteaux Senilhac in Pauillac, the Saint-Emilion Grand Cru Tour Saint-Pierre, and also a wine in the Entre Deux Mers that's rated as a Bordeaux Superior called Chateau Larteau. And these had been purchased by their Chinese owners between 2016 and 2017. They were taking advantage of the fact that in the case of most of these chateaux, the estates had previously been family owned, and when it came to passing them on, they found that France's 30% inheritance tax and a lack of interest in running the estates meant that they were happy to sell the chateau at quite good prices to their new owners. Initially, Chi Keung Tong and his associates were happy to invest in the properties and made some improvements. They also made some changes which some people found strange. Renaming the chateaus with names that they felt would appeal more in the Chinese market was one of the moves they made that raised some eyebrows. For instance, Clos Bel Air was renamed Chateau Grand Antelope, Grand Antelope, Large Antelope. Now, when in 2019 and beyond, the Chinese government started to crack down on its citizens moving large amounts of capital out of China, and then following on with the problems that went on with COVID, it became untenable for these estates' new Chinese owners to continue managing them. And actually they became quite neglected as a result. So it was that in 2022, somebody called Denis Chazarin and his business partner, Pierre Rigaud, purchased the properties literally just before harvest in the September and took them over. Since then, they've implemented programs of change both in the vineyard and the winery that have made some quite big differences. But the first major change they made was to return these chateaux to their historic names. Clos Bel Air is a tiny chateau. They have 3.8 hectares of vineyard, and although they have since been upgraded, I believe it actually was made in a garage in Liban. So that is how small the winery was. The estate soils here are quite classic clays, but with gravel over what they describe as iron slag. I think that's probably not the prettiest translation, but certainly iron-rich soils. Vineyard management is done according to the tenets of the HVE3 certification, so it's sustainable. And vine age here is excellent. There's some really old vines. The average vine age is something like 40 years. Everything is hand-picked, and fermentation goes on in temperature-controlled concrete tanks. Following fermentation, the wine went into barrel. It's entirely aged in new oak, and it's spent 15 months in there. And not unusually for Pomerol, the blend is 100% Merlot. 2022, lovely, warm, rich, ripe vintage. So to my surprise, I noticed this is labelled as only having 12.5% alcohol. But I think it's fair to say that Denis and Pierre had very little control over the harvest in 2022. Taking over the estates in September, they simply had to pick the fruit that in fact was already ripe. I have to say, I will be interested to try vintages of this over the next few years to see what improvements result from the work they've done both in the vineyard and in re-equipping the cellars. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? So first of all, let's have a look at the colour. I would say that is at best a medium depth of quite vibrant ruby red with purple hints there. Swirling it, the wine appears reasonably viscous. It's clinging to the glass and very slowly forming some tiny tears there. But as I say, the wine's only 12.5%, so that's more likely to be the tannins adding weight to the wine. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? The aromas are very pretty, they're complex, they're just starting to show a little bit of development. Interestingly, there's a touch of sort of blood orange over the top of this, which I sometimes find with Merlot, but then behind that there's some really lovely dark fruit. I'm thinking of sort of damsons. There are some lifted mulberry notes, There's plenty of hints of spice. There's very clearly a sort of a cedary note coming from the new oak there. There's a gingery note behind that. There's plenty going on in the aromas there. As I say, they're just starting to show some of that mature development character. Perhaps just the first hints of sort of truffle and mushroom notes, but those are just very sort of delicate, enticing hints. So let's have a taste. The palate's medium bodied, got very fine tannins, and it's got a lovely freshness. And again, that sort of slightly sort of citric blood orange note right to the front of the palate. But behind it, there are fine tannins. Perhaps there is just that hint of truffle. There are chocolatey notes. There's a lifted fresh mulberry note to the fruit as well. And then there is that sort of core of damsons, perhaps a sort of a darker, richer note, a bullis note, sort of black plum. And then beyond that, you're getting hints of sort of bitter licorice. I think the bitter licorice note is emphasised by the fact that the good acidity and the fine tannins are just sort of counterpointing each other and making the back palate really quite mouth-watering. The enduring finish is a delicate red fruit, developed red plum, perhaps with that hint of truffle again, but overlaid with some lovely cedary, cinnamon, nutmeg, spice notes. The wine's quite restrained, but it has this lovely vivacity that's keeping the fruit running through it. As I say, it's not a heavy wine, it's mid-weight. I suspect it's a wine that would age very happily for another 10 to 15 years, not for long aging, but it's lovely and approachable now. I took a look at the Wine Searcher aggregated critics score for this wine, and I noticed that this vintage received an 89 out of 100. And I feel slightly sorry for it for that, because I think possibly the wine may have opened since those critics assessed the wine, and it's perhaps giving us this more balanced, harmonious and really very accessible perfumed nature. I'm really quite enjoying this wine, and as I say, I will be interested to see how future vintages develop under the new ownership. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, I'd be really grateful if you'd like, consider subscribing, better still, and that way set yourself an alert and you can be notified every time I publish a new tasting. If you have friends you think might like to watch the video, do please pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your endorsement in that way. If you've got any comments you'd like to leave, I'd love to know what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. I will leave a link in the notes below to the Wine Searcher website and the web page where you can find out where you can buy this wine and what its current pricing is. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, and I do hope you'll come and join us for another tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.